Set the papers down and keep your hands where I can see them.
I live here. Those papers are for this house.
We got a burglary call. Start with your ID.
You can have my ID, but verify the address too. This is my property. Shut up. Just do what you're told. I'm telling you the fastest way to clear this up.
You don't want to do what I said, so you're under arrest.
No, verify the address first. You're seconds from putting cuffs on a homeowner.
This white neighbor thought she was calling police on a thief. These officers thought they were detaining some random black guy near a house. They didn't realize they were about to arrest the homeowner, who was also the city's new U.S. Marshal. And the second that detail came out, everything about their confidence changed. Where are you watching from? State or country? Drop it in the comments. And if you like stories where proof beats bias and people actually get held accountable, hit like and subscribe. Andre Holloway had lived at that house for years. He wasn't visiting. He wasn't hanging around. It was his place. That day he was carrying boxes between his car and the house. Normal stuff. Nothing secret, nothing rushed. Patricia Crow had just moved into the neighborhood. She saw Andre near the property with boxes and decided he couldn't belong there. She didn't walk over and ask a respectful question. She didn't keep it simple. She went straight to calling 911. On the 911 call, she described Andre like he was committing a crime. She made it sound urgent. She pushed the idea that the house was being broken into. She made sure police showed up ready to treat him like a suspect. 2 officers arrived and locked onto Andre immediately. They didn't start by checking the house. They didn't start by confirming the address with dispatch and running the homeowner info. They approached Andre like they already had their answer. Andre explained he lived there. He stayed calm. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't argue in circles. He told them the basic facts and tried to end it quickly. The officers didn't accept it. They demanded more. They treated his explanation like an excuse. Andre showed them proof that he lived there and that the property was his. The officers looked at it, but they didn't actually verify it. They didn't step aside and run the information. They didn't call it in. They didn't take the simple steps that would have ended the situation in minutes. Instead, they kept escalating. They gave orders. They tightened the space around him. They talked like they were preparing to detain him. One officer moved as if he was about to put Andre in handcuffs, even though Andre was standing in his own driveway with documents in his hand. Patricia stayed close enough to watch. She didn't correct herself. She didn't step in and say she might have been wrong. She acted like the police were there to prove her right. Andre kept telling them to verify the information. They didn't do it. And then Andre told them who he was, the city's new U.S. Marshal. The officers didn't apologize when Andre said he was the U.S. Marshal. They didn't immediately admit they'd skipped verification. They did what people do when they realized they went too far. They started trying to rewind the scene without calling it a rewind. Their tone changed. Their posture changed. The commands started turning into questions. They suddenly wanted to look at the documents again. Suddenly, they were willing to call things in. Funny how that works. Andre didn't start yelling. He didn't flex. He stayed focused on one thing: the fact that they were seconds away from arresting him at his own house based on a neighbor's assumption. He told them to do what they should have done at the start: verify the address, verify the name, and document what happened. He didn't let it become some quiet handshake moment where everyone pretends it was confusion. Dispatch confirmed what Andre had been saying the whole time. He lived there. The house was his. There was no burglary, no forced entry, no victim. Just a caller who saw a black man and decided it was impossible he belonged. Patricia didn't suddenly become respectful either. She tried to justify herself right there on the street. The kind of justification people give when they know they're wrong, but don't want to own it. She kept leaning on concern, even though she never asked Andre a single normal question before dialing 911. Andre made sure the officers wrote reports. He made sure names and badge numbers were clear. He made sure the call details were preserved, because he already knew what happens when you let stuff like this end with a casual, "Have a nice day." Nothing changes, nobody learns. Next time it's another person, another driveway, another escalation. And the officers? They tried to close it fast. They tried to leave it as a non-event. Andre didn't let them. In the days after, he treated it like an official case. He got the nearby security footage. not rumors. Actual video from cameras that saw the officers walk up, saw the way they positioned, saw how close it got to cuffs. He requested the 911 call. He requested the police documentation. He pulled everything that could lock the timeline down. Then he lined it up. What Patricia claimed, what officers wrote, what the video showed, what the audio captured, what dispatch logs confirmed. That's when it got ugly for them. Because on the 911 recording, Patricia didn't sound like someone reporting a real crime. She sounded like someone reporting a person. And at one point, she admitted the real reason she called. She believed a black man at that house couldn't possibly belong there. That audio turned her concern into evidence. Andre filed complaints and pushed the department to open an internal investigation. He didn't ask for a favor. He forced a process. The footage and audio made it impossible to shrug off as miscommunication. Internal Affairs started digging into the two officers, and it didn't take long to find what Andre suspected. Both of them already had patterns, prior complaints, prior accusations of racial profiling, stories that looked a lot like this one, just without a U.S. Marshal standing in the driveway with proof and the ability to escalate it. And once investigators saw that pattern, this wasn't about one bad call anymore. It was about officers who repeatedly treated black residents like automatic suspects and expected no serious pushback. By the end of the internal investigation phase, the department suspended both officers. The case stayed active. More reviews, more scrutiny, more eyes. And Andre didn't stop with the department. He filed a lawsuit against Patricia Crow for racial discrimination, harassment, and filing a false police report. Because this wasn't just about the cops showing up. It started with her decision to weaponize her assumption and outsource it to law enforcement. Internal Affairs didn't start from feelings. They started from records. Andre gave them a tight package, security footage from nearby cameras, the 911 call audio, the incident report paperwork, and the dispatch timeline. That combo did two things. It locked down what happened. It also removed the usual wiggle room people hide behind when they want to interpret events. Investigators listened to the 911 call first. That was the trigger. Patricia didn't report a crime she witnessed. She reported a belief. She described Andre as if his presence alone was suspicious. Then, she said the part that ended her credibility. She called because she didn't think a black man could belong at that house. Not because she saw a forced entry. Not because she saw broken windows. Not because she saw anyone asking for help. Just bias. Then they watched the video. The footage showed the officers arriving already locked in on Andre. It showed them focusing on him instead of verifying the situation. It showed them ignoring the easiest step in the world. Check the address, confirm residency, end the call. They kept pressing Andre even after he provided proof. The video also matched Andre's complaint about escalation. The officers tightened the encounter toward detention instead of backing off to verify, and the paperwork didn't save them either. The reports didn't match the clean reality that Andre was a long-time resident moving boxes. The language leaned toward suspicion. It read like they were building a justification, not documenting facts. Internal Affairs noticed that. They always do when the footage is clear. After that, the investigation moved to the officer's history. Both officers had prior complaints that looked familiar. Stops, detentions, suspicious person calls that got heated fast, especially involving black residents. Even when earlier complaints didn't lead to punishment, the pattern was still there in the files. Same type of allegation, same type of behavior, same type of excuse. That's what turned this case into a department problem. Because once you have video of officers refusing to verify clear proof, plus a caller admitting racial assumptions, plus a history of similar complaints, nobody can honestly sell it as an honest mistake. The department suspended both officers while the investigation continued. Their supervisors got pulled in too. Questions came up about training, oversight, and why repeated complaints didn't change anything. And outside the department, the story started traveling. Neighbors talked. People shared the clip once it got out that there was footage. People focused on the part that hit hardest. Andre did everything right and still almost got arrested at home. A lot of black homeowners and renters recognize the setup immediately because they've lived versions of it, not always with cameras, not always with proof that officers feel forced to respect. Andre's lawsuit against Patricia moved forward at the same time. She didn't get to hide behind, "I was scared." The 911 recording undercut that. It wasn't fear of a crime. It was certainty that Andre couldn't belong. The lawsuit framed it the way it really was: discrimination, harassment, and using police as a weapon. That pressure mattered because it stopped everyone from pretending it was only about the officers. Patricia started it. She created the danger. She made a choice, and then she doubled down on it. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs finished their findings. The department didn't just keep the officers on a temporary suspension to calm things down. They moved toward termination. The evidence was too clean. The pattern was too obvious. Keeping them would have been the department announcing it was fine with this happening again. By the time the department made the final decision, both officers lost their jobs. Andre didn't treat that as the finish line. He kept going on the civil case, because getting fired doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't pay for the harm. It doesn't set a public standard. The lawsuit was where the full accountability landed. By the time the civil case went to court, Patricia Crowe couldn't hide behind vague excuses. Andre's team didn't walk in with opinions. They walked in with hard material: the 911 call, the video footage, the dispatch timeline, and the police paperwork. The 911 call did most of the damage on its own. Patricia didn't report a real crime. She reported a belief that Andre didn't belong. And she didn't keep it neutral. The recording showed she made the call because she saw a black man at the house and decided that meant he had to be doing something illegal. That wasn't being cautious. That was discrimination turning into a police encounter. Then the footage got played. It showed Andre doing normal homeowner tasks. It showed officers treating his presence like the problem. It showed them refusing to do the basic verification steps that would have ended it fast. Andre had proof. They had time. They still chose suspicion. The paperwork didn't help them either. The reports leaned into justification language instead of facts. When the audio and video don't match the written story, juries notice. Judges notice. Everybody notices. Patricia tried to defend herself, but her own recorded words boxed her in. She couldn't claim she was reacting to forced entry or damage. There wasn't any. She couldn't claim she asked questions and got ignored. She didn't ask anything. She went straight to 911. She couldn't claim she was just protecting the neighborhood, when the evidence showed she was policing who she thought was allowed to exist there. The case also made the bigger point clear. Andre did everything right and still got treated like a suspect at his own home. Calm tone, proof in hand, no threat, no crime. And they still moved toward cuffs. That's what hit hardest in court. The what if that didn't happen only because Andre had a title the officers feared. Andre won. The judgment landed at $150,000 against Patricia. She didn't just lose money. She lost her job too once the case and recordings became public. Her name became attached to what she did, not what she told herself she was doing. The officers were already gone by then. Fired after the internal investigation. Their complaint history didn't look like a coincidence anymore. It looked like a pattern that finally ran into someone with enough leverage and enough documentation to force an outcome. And that's why the story didn't end as one racist neighbor and two bad cops. It exposed how fast the pipeline works. Bias makes the call. Police treat it as truth. And a normal person ends up one step from a life-changing arrest. Andre didn't win because he got lucky. He won because he recorded, requested, documented, and pushed it all the way through. He didn't let anyone minimize it. He didn't let anyone quietly reset the scene. And the message that stuck, the one people kept repeating afterward, was simple. Andre only avoided the worst outcome because he had a badge that forced the system to take him seriously. Most black homeowners don't have that shield. They still have to survive the same assumptions. Now I want to know what you would have done in Andre's position. Would you have stayed calm? Would you have recorded? Would you have pushed it into court? Tell me in the comments, and if you've ever dealt with someone trying to police where you belong, share your story too. And if you want more story times where proof beats prejudice and people actually face consequences like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.
Come on, stand up.
Officer, I can't. I'm paralyzed.
No, stand up. Let me see you stand.
I can't use my legs. I'm telling you, I'm paralyzed.
Quit refusing. Stand up now.
I'm not refusing. Stand.
All right, let's go.
The officer kept ordering the man to stand up over and over, like volume would change physics. The man stayed seated in his wheelchair outside his own house, calm, steady, explaining he couldn't do it because he was paralyzed. The officer didn't accept that. He treated the inability to stand like refusal. And the second neighbors realized what was happening, phones came up fast. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you follow stories where cameras, procedure, and basic common sense force accountability, hit like and subscribe, because this situation went sideways for one reason. The officer wouldn't listen. Here's how it started. A welfare call came in about a person outside a residence who might be intoxicated or unresponsive. Dispatch sent an officer to check it out. When Officer Tyler Kessler arrived, he saw Darnell Price in a wheelchair near the front of the home. Darnell wasn't in the street. He wasn't approaching anyone. He was simply outside, with a bag beside him on the property. Kessler approached and began issuing instructions instead of slowing down and asking basic questions. He told Darnell to stand. Darnell responded calmly and explained he couldn't. He told the officer he was paralyzed and couldn't move his legs. Kessler repeated the same instruction anyway. He treated Darnell not standing as non-compliance. Darnell repeated the explanation again, that he couldn't stand and couldn't use his legs. The interaction drew attention fast because it didn't match what people expect from a welfare check. Neighbors started coming outside. At least 2 people began recording from nearby because they heard the officer insisting a wheelchair user stand up and saw Darnell staying calm while trying to explain. Kessler kept the focus on commands. Darnell kept the focus on facts. The gap between those two things is where the tension grew. After multiple failed attempts to get Darnell to stand, Kessler moved closer and grabbed him. He tried to pull Darnell out of the wheelchair. Darnell's body dropped when the officer tried to force him up because his legs couldn't support him. The chair shifted. Darnell ended up on the ground. The witnesses reacted immediately, and the phone stayed locked on the scene. Kessler then moved to restrain Darnell on the ground, treating the situation like it had turned into resistance. Instead of recognizing it as a medical reality he just ignored. Kessler put Darnell in handcuffs while Darnell was still on the ground. The wheelchair was a few feet away. The porch ramp was right there. The house was right there. Nothing about the scene suggested Darnell had been trying to run, reach for something, or get away. It looked like what it was, a man who had been pulled out of his chair and couldn't catch himself. Darnell kept talking, and he kept it consistent. He repeated that he was paralyzed and could not stand. He said he couldn't move his legs. He didn't switch into insults. He didn't start yelling at the crowd. He stayed focused on one thing, explaining the physical limitation that the officer was refusing to accept. Kessler stayed locked on commands. He continued ordering Darnell to stand up. He treated the inability to do it as disobedience. At that point, it didn't matter how many times Darnell explained it, because the officer had already framed the situation as refusal, and everything after that got interpreted through that lens. The neighbors kept recording, and that mattered because the moment had turned from uncomfortable to serious. People didn't just film Darnell. They filmed the wheelchair. They filmed how close the chair was to him. They filmed the ramp and the front of the home to show he wasn't out wandering. They filmed the officer repeating the stand-up commands while Darnell was restrained on the ground. You could hear some of the witnesses speaking while filming, calling out that Darnell had already explained he was paralyzed before the officer touched him. They weren't trying to argue legal terms. They were doing something simpler, making sure the timeline was captured clearly on audio. Kessler noticed he was being filmed. His attention split. Part of him stayed focused on Darnell. Part of him shifted to crowd control. He told people to back up. He told them to stop getting involved. He tried to regain control of the scene through the crowd, even though the crowd wasn't touching anything. They were just recording and talking. Darnell stayed on the ground in cuffs, still repeating that he couldn't stand and couldn't use his legs. The more he repeated it, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a person changing his story. It was the same explanation every time. At this point, the original purpose of the call mattered. Dispatch had sent police for a welfare check. That means, is this person okay? Should have been the main question from the start. Instead, the officer turned it into, will this person obey? And now the consequences were sitting in the middle of the street for everyone to see. Then paramedics arrived. They pulled up because the call involved a welfare concern, and now there was a person on the ground after physical handling. They didn't show up with the same command approach. They came in with assessment mode. One paramedic moved to Darnell first. They checked his responsiveness and condition. They asked basic questions about what happened and what he could feel and move. They looked at the wheelchair and how Darnell was positioned, and it immediately framed the situation as medical, not disciplinary. Darnell explained again that he was paralyzed. He explained he couldn't move his legs. He explained he couldn't stand. The difference this time was that the listener wasn't trying to turn it into a compliance test. The listener was evaluating it as a medical fact. The paramedics checked him. They looked for injuries from the fall. They assessed whether he needed transport or further care. They confirmed directly and clearly that Darnell had a mobility impairment and could not walk. They also made it clear it wasn't a new claim made under pressure. It was documented. He wasn't improvising. This wasn't a maybe. The medical staff treated it as established. That confirmation changed the whole scene because it took the situation out of the officer's interpretation. Darnell didn't have to convince anyone anymore. Medical professionals had checked him and confirmed he could not do the thing he'd been ordered to do. Kessler's posture changed after that. He didn't have a clean way to keep calling it resistance once the paramedics said on scene that Darnell was unable to stand. The cameras were still rolling. The neighbors were still watching. The medical staff was still present. Then the supervisor arrived. Sergeant Santos stepped in and immediately started gathering facts. She didn't treat the neighbor recordings as background noise. She could see the phones. She could see the wheelchair. She could see that paramedics were already confirming the disability. She moved the focus to identification and verification. Santos had Darnell's ID retrieved from his bag instead of forcing Darnell to reach for it while restrained. That part mattered because it showed the supervisor was thinking about safety and procedure, not just control. She confirmed who he was and that he lived there. With the paramedics confirming the disability and the supervisor verifying identity and residence, there was no justification left for keeping him cuffed. The handcuffs came off. Paramedics and/or the supervisor helped get Darnell back into his wheelchair safely. Darnell stayed calm through that process too. No victory speech, no screaming match. Just the basic outcome he'd been trying to reach the whole time, being treated like a person with a disability, not a suspect. And the witnesses kept recording until that point, because they understood something important. The ending matters as much as the middle. It shows whether the system corrected itself or tried to cover. When Sergeant Maribel Santos arrived, she didn't walk up like she was joining a confrontation. She walked up like she was joining an incident that needed to be documented correctly. She took a quick look at the layout first. Darnell in his wheelchair again, paramedics still there. Officer Kessler nearby, neighbors filming from different angles, the front of the house and the ramp clearly visible. That matters because the location told a basic truth. This wasn't someone stopped in public. This was a resident outside his own home. Santos started by getting a clean version of the call. Welfare check. Possibly intoxicated or unresponsive person. She then checked what had actually happened since arrival. She asked what commands were given. She asked what Darnell said in response. She asked what the paramedics confirmed. The paramedics explained what they found. Mobility impairment. Darnell could not stand or walk. Documented. They told her there was no medical basis to treat him as someone refusing to stand. He physically couldn't. Santos then focused on identification and residence. She didn't have Darnell dig for his ID while stressed. She had it retrieved from his bag. She checked it. She confirmed the address matched. She confirmed he lived there. At that point, the whole reason for the scene changed. The welfare concern was resolved. The medical question was addressed. The identity question was addressed. The only thing left was the fact that the response had escalated into force and restraints. Santos separated Kessler from Darnell and the crowd for a minute. Not for a dramatic lecture, for control and clarity. She spoke to him away from the immediate pressure of witnesses and phones. Kessler had to explain why he kept ordering a wheelchair user to stand after being told multiple times that the person was paralyzed. He had to explain why he tried to pull Darnell out of the chair. He had to explain why the situation ended with cuffs. And there was no clean answer that made it look reasonable, because the basic information had been available the whole time. Darnell had said it repeatedly. The wheelchair was obvious. The neighbors had recorded the sequence. Then paramedics confirmed it. Santos then did what supervisors do when they realize an incident is going to be reviewed later. She controlled what got documented in the moment. She made sure the welfare check was recorded as a welfare check. She made sure the medical confirmation was included. She made sure the removal of handcuffs and the reason for removing them were clear. She made sure Darnell's impairment was noted as documented, not claimed. She also addressed the witnesses without trying to intimidate them. She didn't demand phones. She didn't threaten arrests for recording. She kept it practical. Distance, safety, keep the walkway clear. The crowd stayed where they were. The cameras stayed up. Darnell stayed calm through all of it. He wasn't performing for the crowd. He wasn't trying to escalate back. He just kept repeating what mattered when asked. He was disabled. He couldn't stand. And he'd said that before the officer tried to force him out of his chair. Before Santos cleared the scene, she checked if Darnell needed any follow-up medical attention. The paramedics confirmed he was okay to remain home unless symptoms changed. They gave basic guidance like they would for anyone who took a fall. Santos then ended the encounter the way it should have ended earlier, confirming Darnell was safe, confirming he was at his home, and confirming there was no reason for detention. Kessler had to stand there while that reality settled in. He had arrived expecting a simple welfare check. He left knowing the street had recorded his decisions in real time, and now those decisions would be reviewed as more than split-second judgment. The footage didn't stay on that street. Within hours, clips started circulating in neighborhood groups and local community pages. Not a full documentary edit. Just short pieces that showed the core problem. An officer ordering a wheelchair user to stand, ignoring repeated explanations about paralysis, then pulling him from the chair and handcuffing him on the ground until medics and a supervisor corrected it. People shared it for one reason. The timeline was clear. Darnell stayed calm. The officer kept pushing the same command. The fall happened after the officer tried to force him out of the chair. The cuffs happened after that. The correction only happened after paramedics confirmed the disability and a supervisor verified ID and residence. That sequence mattered because it took away the usual argument that we don't know what happened before the camera started. In this case, multiple phones started early, and different angles caught different parts of it. By the next day, It wasn't just neighbors talking. It was local attention. Disability advocates picked it up because it wasn't a rare situation. A welfare call, a disability, and an officer treating can't as won't. Civil rights voices picked it up because the escalation wasn't about safety. It was about control and assumptions. People with visible disabilities shared similar stories in the comments. The same theme every time. Someone in authority refuses to accept a limitation and turns it into attitude. Darnell didn't go online trying to be famous. He didn't need to. The video did what it always does, forced a response. The department couldn't just ignore it because it wasn't a rumor. It was on camera and paramedics were part of the story. That meant there were official medical responders who had already contradicted the resistance framing on scene. The department opened an internal review. That usually means pulling body camera footage, radio traffic, dispatch notes, and supervisor reports. It also means collecting any use of force documentation and checking what the officer wrote compared to what the footage shows. And this is where departments either get defensive or get honest. In this case, they acknowledged the situation escalated unnecessarily. They didn't have much choice. A wheelchair user with a documented mobility impairment can't refuse to stand the way an able-bodied person can. If an officer keeps issuing the same command after being told it's impossible, that's not compliance enforcement. That's failure to assess. The review focused on the decision points. Why the officer didn't slow down after Darnell explained paralysis. Why the officer treated the wheelchair as irrelevant. Why force was used to remove him from the chair. Why handcuffs were applied after the fall instead of switching to medical support. Why the scene only corrected after paramedics and a supervisor arrived. The public pressure didn't come from one clip. It came from how simple the mistake was. The officer had the key information early and ignored it. The department's response included retraining and policy reminders around welfare checks and disability recognition. That's the part agencies often lean on. We're addressing it through training. People hear that and roll their eyes, but it still matters when the training changes how the next officer handles the next call. They also emphasize what supervisors and medics did correctly. Verify, assess, document, de-escalate. That was the contrast everyone saw. The system corrected itself, but late. For Kessler, the consequences were real, even if they weren't dramatic. Incidents like this follow an officer. They show up in reviews. They get discussed in briefings. They affect trust on calls. They can lead to discipline depending on policy, history, and what the internal documents show. At minimum, it put his judgment under a microscope. For Darnell, the consequences weren't just he got uncuffed. He had to live with what happened outside his own home. He had to process being treated like a problem for sitting in his chair. He had to deal with the fact that he explained his disability clearly and still ended up on the ground in handcuffs. That sticks with people. He also had choices afterward. He could file a formal complaint. He could request records. He could consult an attorney. He could push for disability-focused policy changes so the next person doesn't have to be proven disabled enough on the pavement before an officer believes them. And the community around him didn't forget it either. Neighbors who recorded didn't just capture content. They created accountability. Without those phones, the story could have been written as uncooperative subject refused commands. With the phones, the story stayed tied to reality. Here's the lesson, and it's not complicated. A welfare check isn't supposed to turn into a compliance contest. When someone tells an officer they physically can't do something, the officer doesn't get to treat that like disrespect. The job is to assess, verify, get medical help if needed, not force a demonstration. So let me ask you, if you were one of the neighbors watching this from your porch, would you have recorded? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed quiet and hoped someone else did it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories where everyday situations turn into accountability moments, because someone hit record and someone demanded facts, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
You passed places to stop. Why didn't you stop back there?
Because it was dark. I was trying to stop where it was safer,
I gave you lawful commands.
and I followed them. From the start, but you put a gun on me over a seatbelt stop before you knew anything.
This officer thought he was detaining just another driver for a routine seatbelt stop, but he had no idea he was escalating a traffic stop on a sitting police chief who knew policy, procedure, and constitutional limits better than the people pointing commands at him. The officer believed he had control of the encounter, and that belief pushed him into a decision that made the whole stop dangerous. He drew his firearm and treated the driver like a fleeing suspect. The moment the officers realized who was behind the wheel, the power dynamic shifted, and it shifted fast, because suddenly this was no longer a small stop that could be explained away with a few vague words. Where are you watching from today? What city and state or what country? Put it in the comments. And if you like stories where calm discipline and documentation beat intimidation, hit like and subscribe, because this one shows exactly how a simple stop can become a lawsuit when officers lose their judgment. Here's how it started. It was early morning in Jacksonville, Florida, at a time when the roads were mostly clear and the lighting was uneven depending on the block. Chief Darnell Hayes was driving to work in his own vehicle, and he was already mentally in work mode because he was on duty and heading in to start his day. He was not looking for attention, and he was not trying to make a point. He was simply driving the way thousands of people do every morning. Officer Mason Klein was working patrol and watching traffic. He decided to stop Hayes for what he believed was a seatbelt violation. That kind of stop is normally routine, and most officers handle it with a quick approach, a brief conversation, and a warning or citation. Nothing about a seatbelt stop requires a high-intensity response, unless something else happens to justify it. Klein activated his lights behind Hayes. Hayes noticed the patrol car and made a decision that many people make for safety, especially people who have spent years responding to roadside incidents. He did not stop immediately in the first dark or awkward spot he saw. He continued driving for a short distance so he could pull over in an area that felt safer, more visible, and less isolated. He did not accelerate away, and he did not weave or attempt to lose the patrol car. He simply kept moving long enough to reach a location where he believed the stop could happen without putting him in unnecessary danger. Klein did not treat that choice as a safety decision. Klein treated it as a refusal to comply, and that interpretation changed the entire stop. Instead of approaching as if this was a minor traffic issue, he approached as if he was dealing with a driver who was trying to evade police. He positioned his vehicle in a way that signaled escalation and urgency, and he exited his patrol car with a posture and pace that matched a felony-style stop, not a seatbelt warning. When Klein reached Hayes' vehicle, he drew his firearm. That action immediately raised the stakes for everyone involved, because the encounter was no longer a conversation. From that point on, Hayes had to manage the situation as if one misunderstanding could lead to someone making a catastrophic decision. Hayes kept his hands visible and did not make any sudden movements. He followed instructions carefully and spoke in a measured way because he understood that an officer who had already pulled a gun was operating on fear and assumptions, not on clear evidence. Hayes explained why he did not stop instantly and said he had continued driving briefly because he wanted to pull over in a place he considered safe. He also made it clear that he was on duty and heading to work. He was not arguing about authority, and he was not trying to debate on the roadside. He was trying to bring the encounter back to reality and reduce the danger. Klein did not accept that explanation as reasonable. Instead, he pressed Hayes as if Hayes had committed a more serious offense than a seatbelt violation. He asked questions that treated the short delay as suspicious behavior, and he framed the situation as if Hayes needed to justify himself rather than simply comply with a normal traffic stop. He ordered Hayes out of the vehicle and maintained a controlling tone, which signaled that Klein wanted dominance in the encounter and was not interested in a routine resolution. Backup officers arrived, including Officer Tessa Ramirez. Ramirez quickly understood that the scene was out of proportion to the original reason for the stop. She observed Hayes' behavior and could see that he was not acting aggressively, not acting erratically, and not presenting himself like someone who was about to attack anyone. She also observed Klein's posture and the drawn weapon, and she recognized that once that level of escalation happens, officers often start looking for reasons to justify it after the fact. That is exactly where the stop began to go next. Klein shifted from enforcement of a seatbelt allegation into investigative fishing. He questioned Hayes repeatedly about why he kept driving after the lights came on, and he layered on additional questions that were not necessary to resolve a seatbelt issue. He pushed the encounter toward a vehicle search by probing for anything that might allow him to claim suspicion of something else. He asked about what was inside the car and tried to move the interaction toward consent, because consent searches are an easy way for officers to expand a stop, even when they do not have probable cause. Hayes did not give consent. Hayes refused in a controlled and professional way, and he did it without raising his voice or giving Klein an emotional reaction. He understood what consent meant, and he understood how stops like this get reframed later in reports. He also understood that the moment he allowed a search, just to get it over with, he would be validating an escalation that never should have happened. Klein reacted poorly to that boundary. He continued trying to justify the detention by treating Hayes' short delay in pulling over as proof that Hayes was suspicious. He kept the tone accusatory and tried to maintain pressure, because pressure is how officers sometimes get people to make mistakes, become emotional, or start pleading. Hayes did not do any of that. He stayed composed, stayed clear, and kept the stop focused on what it was supposed to be about. As the encounter dragged on, Hayes identified himself again, clearly, with enough detail that the officers could verify it if they chose to do their jobs properly. He said who he was and made it obvious that he was not a random driver guessing at a title. At that point, the stop reached a moment where Klein had to decide whether he was going to keep escalating based on pride or whether he was going to verify the information and reset the encounter. Klein did not immediately reset. He acted skeptical, which mattered because it revealed how committed he was to the story he had already built in his head. Instead of backing down and treating the situation like a seatbelt stop, he continued holding Hayes in an elevated posture, while he sought verification through normal law enforcement channels. The process to confirm Hayes' identity began through communications and dispatch checks, because that is how officers confirm credentials and identities when they claim they are unsure. While that verification process was happening, the atmosphere shifted in a subtle but real way. Ramirez became more cautious in her tone and body language because she could sense that Klein might have made a serious mistake. Klein's posture also changed, because a drawn weapon and a high-intensity detention look very different when the person detained turns out to be a senior law enforcement official who understands the law and will not let the incident disappear quietly. By that point, Hayes was no longer just trying to get through a stressful stop safely. He was watching how officers behaved when they thought nobody important was looking, and the officers were about to learn that this stop was not going to be forgotten or buried, because the driver had the knowledge and the position to force accountability. The confirmation came back the way confirmations always come back, when someone tells the truth and the system finally checks. The name matched. The position matched. The officers on scene suddenly had a new problem, because the stop they had been running like a possible fleeing suspect situation now had a clear identity attached to it. Chief Darnell Hayes. You could tell the change wasn't philosophical. It was survival. The tone softened because it had to. The posture changed because it had to. This was no longer a random driver they could pressure, lecture, or casually search. This was a senior law enforcement official who understood every step they had taken and could explain in plain language why several of those steps didn't make legal sense. Officer Klein tried to recover control without admitting he lost it. He shifted his focus back toward the original justification, the alleged seatbelt violation, as if the last several minutes had been an overreaction that didn't count. He also tried to reframe the escalation as standard safety procedure. He kept returning to the same point. Hayes didn't stop immediately when the lights came on, and that made Klein believe something was wrong. Hayes didn't let that excuse stand unchallenged, but he also didn't turn it into a shouting contest. He explained the decision the way an experienced supervisor explains a decision. He continued driving briefly because he wanted a safe location, and he stopped as soon as he reached one. He made it clear he was not attempting to evade, and he made it clear that his behavior during the stop had been calm and compliant from the start. That put Klein in a corner because the facts didn't support the story Klein wanted. If Klein insisted Hayes was fleeing, he would have to explain why the vehicle did not speed away, why Hayes stopped in a well-lit area, and why Hayes immediately complied once the stop began. If Klein insisted the drawn firearm and the high-intensity commands were appropriate, he would have to explain what specific threat indicators existed beyond the short distance Hayes drove before stopping. That is the kind of explanation that sounds weak on body camera and even worse in a report, because it turns into broad statements like, "I feared for my safety," with nothing concrete under it. So Klein went to the next move officers use when they need to justify time and intensity. He tried to find something else. He started pressing again toward the vehicle. The questions weren't framed as questions anymore. They were framed as an attempt to create a reason. He tried to angle toward a search, or at least toward a look inside, because the easiest way to make an over-escalated stop seem worth it is to claim you found something. Hayes refused again, clearly and professionally. He did not argue about whether Klein could search. He simply did not give permission. He kept the stop inside its legal limits. He held that line calmly, which made the contrast obvious. One side was trying to expand the stop without a solid basis, and the other side was refusing to be bullied into waiving rights. That refusal forced another shift. Officer Ramirez and the other responding officers started acting like they wanted the stop to end. They weren't laughing. They weren't relaxed. They were watching Klein choose between doubling down or cutting losses. This is where pride usually decides what happens next. Pride keeps stops going. Pride creates arrests that don't hold up. Pride turns a citation into handcuffs. Klein tried to keep a firm face, but the momentum was gone. The accusations got smaller. The language got less intense. The earlier fleeing suspect posture didn't match the reality in front of them anymore, especially now that Hayes' identity had been confirmed. At this point, Klein could not credibly claim he was dealing with an unknown threat, because the driver had been identified and had been composed the entire time. A field supervisor arrived, Sergeant Paul Denton. Denton didn't roll up confused about what to do. He rolled up doing damage control. The first thing he did was orient himself to the facts, why the stop started, why the stop escalated, and what the officers had in writing and on camera. Then he focused on the outcome, because supervisors think in outcomes. A supervisor knows what a messy stop turns into later. Complaints, internal reviews, lawyers, headlines. Denton addressed Hayes with a more controlled tone. He treated him like a professional, which was a noticeable change compared to how the stop began. Denton also steered the conversation away from dramatic claims and back toward the only thing that still made sense on paper, the seatbelt allegation. Klein still tried to defend his earlier decision-making, but now he was doing it in front of a supervisor and a police chief. That's not the same as defending it in front of a civilian. The words have to line up with policy. The logic has to line up with law. The timeline has to line up with Bodycam. Hayes listened. Hayes stayed calm. Hayes did not let them rewrite the sequence. He pointed out in a controlled way what the stop had become. A minor traffic allegation had turned into a high-intensity detention with a drawn weapon and an attempt to expand the stop into a search. He also made it clear that he only drove a short distance to a safer location and that he had communicated that from the beginning. Denton understood the core issue right away. Even if Klein claimed he had concerns, the stop still had to be reasonable in scope and duration. Even if Klein claimed he misunderstood the short delay, the response still had to fit the facts. A seatbelt allegation does not naturally lead to guns and prolonged detention unless the driver gives real indicators of danger. Hayes had not. So Denton guided the stop toward the exit. They dropped the bigger framing. They stopped pressing the evasion angle. The search attempt went nowhere because Hayes did not consent and they did not have a real legal foundation to force it. They fell back to a citation because that was the only thing that still matched the original reason for contact. Klein issued the minor citation. The mood on scene was not victory, it was discomfort. It looked like people realizing they had escalated the wrong person in the wrong way for the wrong reason, and now there was no clean way to pretend it never happened. Hayes took the citation and ended the encounter without theatrics. He did not threaten anyone on scene. He did not try to embarrass them in the moment. He did something more effective. He made it clear, through his composure and his precision, that he understood exactly where the stop went wrong, and that the next steps would happen through oversight channels, not roadside arguments. He left and continued to work. And the officers stayed behind with the footage, the radio logs, and the realization that this stop had already become a record. After Hayes got to work, he didn't treat the stop like an awkward story to laugh off. He treated it like a serious incident that could have gone badly for any regular person, and the only reason it didn't go worse was because he stayed controlled and understood exactly how to keep the stop inside legal lines. He also understood something else. If he didn't document it properly, the narrative would get written without him. So he started doing what experienced law enforcement leaders do when they need the truth preserved. He created a clean timeline while the details were fresh. He noted the reason given for the stop, how far he drove before pulling over, what location he chose and why, when the firearm came out, and how the officers tried to shift the stop into a search situation. He didn't write it like a rant. He wrote it like a report. Then he went through the channels that matter. He requested the body camera footage. He requested the dash camera footage if it existed. He requested the CAD logs and radio traffic that showed how the stop was classified in real time, because that detail matters. A seatbelt stop logged as a routine traffic stop is one thing. A seatbelt stop that gets treated like an attempt to flee situation is another. The labels officers choose in the moment often tell you what was driving their decisions. Inside the department, word moved fast. Not because Hayes wanted drama, but because cops talk. Someone heard the name. Someone heard, "We stopped a chief." Someone heard, "Gun came out." People started connecting it to the usual pattern they had seen before. A small reason for contact, followed by a big reaction, followed by a quick attempt to make the paperwork match the reaction. Some people defended Klein immediately, because that's what happens when officers circle up. They leaned on the usual phrases. Officer safety, unknown risk. Driver didn't stop immediately. Anything could happen on a traffic stop. Those phrases are common because they're flexible. They can be used to explain almost any escalation after the fact. Other people didn't defend it because the facts were too ugly. They knew the difference between a driver actually trying to run and a driver rolling to a safe location. They knew what true threat indicators look like. They knew that pulling a gun on a compliant driver over a seatbelt allegation creates risk, not safety. They also knew that when the person detained is calm and experienced, the footage usually tells a story without needing a speech. Then the stop started leaking beyond the building. It didn't require a big media campaign. It didn't require a press conference. In situations like this, one clip or one description gets shared with a friend, then another, then it hits the group chats. And once the story is out, it spreads because people recognize the pattern, even if they don't recognize the names. The community reaction wasn't complicated. People weren't debating the seatbelt allegation. They were reacting to the escalation. They were reacting to the gun. They were reacting to the way a minor stop turned into a detention that felt like punishment. And a lot of people said the quiet part out loud. If it happened to a chief, it can happen to anyone. If the chief had been a regular civilian, the stop might have ended very differently. Hayes watched that reaction, but he didn't build his response around public outrage. He built it around proof. He focused on what could be verified. The original alleged violation, the time and distance between lights and pullover, the officer's commands, whether there were any real indicators of danger, and the attempt to search his vehicle without a solid basis. He kept coming back to reasonableness, because that's the standard that matters later when lawyers and reviewers get involved. The internal side moved the way internal systems usually move. There were discussions about policy and training. There were conversations about whether the stop met departmental standards. There were quiet check-ins about how to describe the event without making the department look reckless. There were also conversations that looked like protection, because departments often tried to manage a problem instead of admitting it. Hayes didn't let the story become a misunderstanding. He acknowledged the basic reality that officers sometimes make fast decisions. He did not accept that fast decisions automatically become justified decisions. He knew the difference between a reasonable caution and an unreasonable escalation, and he knew the legal risk created when officers treat a driver like a suspect without evidence. Weeks passed and the situation didn't disappear. The footage existed. The logs existed. The citation existed. The sequence existed. Even if people tried to smooth it over, those records don't care about smoothing. They show what happened. And during that time, Hayes also saw something that likely hardened his position: the way the officers and the system tried to minimize it. Not always with lies, but with soft language, with framing, with excuses that avoided the core question, which was simple. What justified drawing a firearm and detaining a compliant driver over a seatbelt allegation and a short, safety-based delay in pulling over? That question didn't go away, because it didn't have a good answer. By the time months had passed, Hayes wasn't looking at the stop as an isolated moment anymore. He was looking at it as unconstitutional overreach, and he was looking at it through the lens of race and pattern, because he understood what many black drivers have experienced for years. Minor reasons turning into major escalations when assumptions take over. That's when the legal path became unavoidable. Hayes filed a lawsuit seeking $200,000, arguing the stop involved racial profiling and unconstitutional policing, and that the escalation went far beyond what was reasonable for the alleged seatbelt violation. The lawsuit didn't exist because he was angry about a ticket. It existed because the stop showed how quickly an officer could manufacture a dangerous situation out of nothing. And once the lawsuit was filed, the story entered a new phase. Now it wasn't just community talk. Now it was attorneys, records requests, depositions, and policy reviews. Now the officers' decisions would get measured against law, not just against their own explanations. Once Hayes filed the $200,000 lawsuit, the stop stopped being a bad moment and became a legal problem with a paper trail. That matters because courts don't care how confident an officer sounded on scene. They care what facts existed to justify the escalation. The lawsuit focused on a simple chain of decisions. It started with a minor allegation about a seatbelt. Then, the stop escalated into a high-intensity detention. A firearm came out. The officers treated Hayes like a fleeing suspect because he drove a short distance to pull over in a place he considered safe. Then they tried to stretch the stop further by pushing toward a vehicle search, even though they still didn't have real evidence that he was dangerous or involved in a crime. Hayes' legal argument was basically this: the officers turned a routine traffic contact into a constitutional violation, and they did it without a reasonable basis. He also argued it fit racial profiling because the assumptions and the intensity didn't match the behavior on camera, and the escalation happened before officers knew who he was. In other words, they treated him one way when he was just a black driver in the dark, and they treated him another way once they realized he had a title and authority. From the department side, the response followed the usual playbook. They leaned on officer safety. They leaned on, he didn't stop immediately. They leaned on the idea that traffic stops are unpredictable. That language shows up in a lot of cases because it can sound reasonable if you don't look closely. The problem is that unpredictable isn't a legal substitute for specific facts. A short delay to reach a well-lit area is not automatically evasion. An escalation has to be tied to what the officer can actually articulate, not what the officer guessed. Now, the officers had to defend their timeline. They had to explain why the stop went tactical over a seatbelt allegation. They had to explain why a gun was necessary. They had to explain why Hayes was handled as if he was a threat, even though his behavior stayed controlled and compliant. They had to explain why they tried to move toward a search when the original reason for the stop was minor. In a lawsuit, those questions don't get answered with vibes. They get answered with bodycam footage, radio logs, and written reports that can be compared line by line. That comparison is what makes these cases dangerous for departments. If the report reads like a serious criminal stop, but the video shows a calm driver trying to pull over safely, the report becomes a liability. If the officer's justification sounds vague on camera, that vagueness follows them into depositions. If supervisors arrived and immediately tried to shrink the story back down to just a citation, that also becomes part of the record, because it shows the department recognized the escalation wasn't defensible. The lawsuit also created pressure inside the city structure. City attorneys get involved because money is on the line. Risk managers get involved because repeated incidents become patterns. Leadership gets involved because the public doesn't separate one officer from the system when something like this happens. Even if a case settles quietly, it still forces review, because the department doesn't want the same kind of stop happening again and turning into another payout. Behind closed doors, the conversation usually turns practical and blunt. They look at policy, they look at training, they look at how officers interpret a driver continuing to a safe location. They look at when a weapon is drawn and what the minimum facts are supposed to be. They look at consent searches, because departments know the public hates when a minor stop turns into phishing. They also look at supervision, because supervisors exist to stop small problems from becoming big ones. And this stop became big. For Hayes, the stop changed something personal too. He already understood these dynamics, but now he had lived it from the other side while carrying the title that should have insulated him. That's the part that hit people hardest. If a chief could be treated like that while calm and compliant, then the average person with no badge, no status, and no experience had even less protection in the moment. That reality became the lasting message of the story. This wasn't about a seatbelt. It was about how fast an officer can turn uncertainty into aggression, then try to justify it afterward. It was about how composure can keep you alive, but composure shouldn't be the price of basic rights. It was about the difference between lawful policing and control for the sake of control. And it was also about something uncomfortable. Respect changed once the officers knew who Hayes was. The same driver, same hands, same calm tone. The difference was the title. That contrast is what makes people call it profiling, because it suggests the first version of Hayes they responded to wasn't citizen, it was threat. So here's the question for you. If you were driving and you didn't feel safe pulling over immediately, would you keep going to a well-lit area, or would you stop the second you saw lights, even if the location felt risky? And if you've ever had a stop escalate over something small, what was the moment you realized it wasn't about the original reason anymore? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more realistic story times where accountability actually lands, make sure you subscribe.
Step outside right now. Let's go.
Who are you and why are you in my house?
None of your business. Step
You're
outside.
in my home with guns up. Show me a warrant.
Marcus, you're making this worse for
What's
yourself.
waking my kid up with guns in the hallway? Show the warrant or get
Deep
out of my
breath over
house.
body.
The officers were already inside the hallway when Malik Carter fully woke up. Flashlights hit the walls. A weapon light swept across family photos. 2 pistols were up at chest level, like they expected a fight. Malik stood there in his boxers with his hands visible, trying to angle his body so his child stayed behind him and out of the line of sight. The lead officer kept barking for Malik to step outside immediately, like the house belonged to the department, for the next 5 minutes. Malik didn't move fast. He moved careful. He kept his voice steady. He asked who they were and why they were in his home. That question irritated them. You could hear it in their tone. They wanted obedience, not a conversation. Before we go further, drop where you're watching from, country or state. And if you watch these stories for the real-world chess match, recording, accountability, people refusing to be bullied, hit like and subscribe. A lot of folks never see how fast a mistake turns into intimidation until it's on camera. Now, here's how it started, because the sequence matters. Malik and Tiana Carter had a routine every night. Doors checked, locks turned, alarm set, cameras running. Not a big dramatic security setup, just basic protection. They had a kid in the house, and they lived in a place where people loved to say it was safe. But Malik didn't confuse quiet with immune. That night was normal. They went to bed, no visitors, no late calls, no chaos. Then, sometime before dawn, the house got hit with movement and noise. Not a polite knock, not a doorbell. More like a sudden presence at the entry that didn't belong there. The next moment, Malik was awake to armed strangers inside. The first thing he focused on was his child. The kid had gotten up, confused and scared, pulled by the noise. Malik stepped into the hallway fast enough to block the kid from walking forward, but not so fast that an officer could claim he charged. Tiana came out seconds later, half asleep, and instantly alert. She saw guns. She saw her partner undressed and cornered in his own hallway. She saw her child behind him. Her brain clicked into one mode: keep everyone alive and document everything. Malik kept trying to slow the situation down. He asked again what they were doing there. The lead officer, Brandt, refused to give a clean explanation. He treated Malik like a problem to manage. He kept repeating the command to go outside, as if stepping onto the porch would magically make the entry legal. That's when the officers introduced their reason. They were looking for someone. A fugitive. A name Malik had never heard in his life. Malik told them he didn't know the person. No hesitation. No maybe. He didn't add extra details that could be twisted, just a direct answer. The normal outcome right there should have been simple. Wrong house. Back out. Apology. Leave the family to calm down. That's not what happened. Instead of ending it, the officers leaned in harder. They kept asking the same thing in different ways, like persistence would produce a different truth. They started scanning the house like they were shopping for a justification. They demanded Malik's ID while standing inside his home, even though he hadn't invited them in, and they still hadn't said anything clear about lawful authority. Malik didn't refuse because he wanted a standoff. He refused because the order made no sense in context. They were already in the wrong place. They were already pointing guns near a family, and now they wanted Malik to help them paper over it with compliance. He asked for a warrant. This is where the officer's story started changing, right on camera. At first, they suggested the entry wasn't really an entry because the door was open or unlocked. That's a convenient explanation because it frames the homeowner as careless and the officers as reactive, not invasive. Malik and Tiana immediately disputed it. They said the doors had been locked. That wasn't an argument about feelings. It was their nightly routine. Then, as Malik kept asking for a warrant, a different explanation started floating around. Now the officers claimed they had been knocking for a long time. That version was meant to make it sound like the family ignored them, like they had no choice but to come in. Those two stories didn't fit together. If the door was open, why the long knocking story? If they'd been knocking forever, why was Malik waking up to them already inside with guns up? The contradictions mattered because they weren't small details. They were the difference between a lawful contact and a serious violation. Brandt tried to end the questions by implying they had legal cover. He hinted at a warrant without producing one. He said it in that confident way some officers do, like the word itself should stop the conversation. Malik didn't let it. Malik kept his hands visible. He kept his voice controlled. He kept repeating the same demand. Show the warrant or explain the emergency that allowed them in without one. No paper appeared, no case number, no judge's name, no dispatch detail that made it sound urgent. Just pressure and impatience. Tiana stayed near enough to keep her child close, but she also positioned her phone so it captured the officers' faces and voices. She wasn't waving it around. She wasn't doing theatrics. She was collecting what they were giving her, shifting explanations and hostile posture. And then came the part that told you exactly what kind of encounter this was going to be. Even with a child in the hallway and cameras visible, the officers acted annoyed that Malik cared they'd brought guns into a sleeping family's home. They minimized it. They treated his concern like an inconvenience. That's not a, "we made a mistake." That's a, "how dare you challenge us?" Malik didn't take the bait. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He did the one thing that tends to make bad behavior unravel. He kept demanding specifics, names, reason, authority, warrant. The officers realized they weren't getting easy compliance. They also realized the footage was building a timeline they couldn't control. So they started looking for leverage, something unrelated they could use to flip the dynamic, something that would make Malik stop focusing on the entry and start worrying about consequences. That pivot began when one of them noticed something in the kitchen area and decided to change the topic. One of the officers shifted his stance and let his flashlight drift past Malik's shoulder down the hall toward the kitchen. That's when the mission changed. Not officially, not out loud. You could just see it in how they started talking. They'd come in claiming they were looking for a fugitive. Malik already told them he didn't know the name. That should have ended the contact. Instead, the officers started acting like he'd spotted a new problem that could justify everything they'd already done. Malik kept repeating the same core point. They were inside his home. They hadn't shown a warrant, and they hadn't explained any emergency. He wanted a supervisor. He wanted documentation. He wanted them out. Brandt didn't answer cleanly. He kept steering back to control. He kept pushing Malik to step outside. It wasn't about safety anymore. It was about getting Malik off his own property line. So the story became, "we talked outside," instead of, "we entered your home." Tiana clocked it too. She didn't argue just to argue. She focused on capturing the parts that couldn't be walked back later. The lack of identification, the lack of warrant, the shifting reasons for entry. She also kept her child close and out of the hallway traffic because these officers were moving like the house was theirs to pace through. Then Brandt tried a different pressure point. He claimed there was marijuana visible in the kitchen. And right away you could tell what that was. A pivot. A bargaining chip. Something to make Malik stop asking about the door and start defending himself. Malik didn't take the bait. He didn't start explaining what was or wasn't in his kitchen. He didn't start confessing to anything. He brought it back to the entry. He wanted the warrant. He wanted the legal basis. He wanted to know why they were pointing weapons inside a family home over a person Malik didn't know. Brandt didn't like that Malik wasn't scared of side quests. So he escalated the tone. He demanded identification again, this time with more edge, like refusing was a crime by itself. Malik didn't need to shout to make the point. He made it plain. Officers don't get to walk into a house without a warrant and then demand papers like the homeowner is crossing a border. At that moment, the officers started stacking contradictions faster. One officer kept leaning on the door was open idea. Another kept implying they'd been knocking forever. Brandt hovered between both stories, depending on what sounded more convincing in the moment. None of them matched the reality that the Carters were asleep and woke up to guns already inside. That mismatch mattered, because Malik was recording the timeline with his words, while Tiana recorded the scene with her camera. Every time the officers changed the explanation, it made the earlier statement look like a lie. Brandt tried to force the conversation into a different lane again. He acted like Malik's questions were the real problem. He treated Malik's calm demand for a warrant like disrespect. He talked down to him. The energy was clear. Comply first, ask questions later. Malik refused that order. He kept his voice even, but he didn't soften the boundary. He told them again that they were being recorded and this would have consequences. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a fact. That's when the officers' attitude got nastier. They started mocking the situation. Not openly laughing like it was a joke, but that dismissive tone that says, they don't think your rights count when they're inconvenienced. They minimized the guns. They minimized the panic they caused. They acted like Malik should be grateful they hadn't done worse. Tiana's patience snapped internally, but she stayed controlled. She kept her phone steady. She kept her child behind her now, creating space between the kid and the officers. She understood something Malik understood too. If they could intimidate the parents into emotional reactions, they could later describe that emotion as aggression. So Malik stayed boring, calm, precise, repeating the same demands. He asked for the warrant again. Brandt implied it existed again. Still nothing. No paper, no specific warrant detail, no clear statement of lawful entry. Just a constant push to get Malik outside and a new attempt to use the kitchen claim as leverage. And then Brandt made the pressure tactic uglier. He brought up Child Protective Services. Not because the child was harmed, not because they saw abuse, not because there was an emergency involving the kid. It came right after Malik wouldn't cooperate and right after the marijuana claim got ignored. It landed like a warning meant to scare parents into silence. That was the moment the encounter crossed from reckless to cruel. Because once an officer mentions CPS in a situation like this, the message is simple. Cooperate or we'll bring the system to your door again, in a different form. Tiana didn't crumble. She tightened up. She kept recording. Malik didn't lose control either. He did what disciplined people do when someone tries intimidation. He returned to facts. He demanded the warrant again. He demanded a supervisor. He demanded they explain how they entered on camera with a straight story that didn't change every 2 minutes. And you could see the officers realizing something uncomfortable. They weren't dealing with someone they could fluster into giving them an excuse. They were dealing with someone who understood that the only thing protecting the officers right now was confusion. And Malik wasn't confused. The moment the officers brought up Child Protective Services, Malik understood what they were doing. They weren't investigating an emergency involving his child. They weren't responding to a welfare call. They were using a family system that scares parents as a tool to get compliance after a shaky entry. That's why it landed when it did, right after Malik kept demanding proof of a warrant, and right after he refused to answer questions that didn't make sense. Malik stayed controlled, but his focus narrowed. He stopped entertaining side conversations and forced everything back to the one issue that mattered. The officers were inside his home, in the middle of the night, with guns out earlier, and they still hadn't shown any legal authority to be there? Brant tried to keep momentum by repeating the same command to step outside. He framed it like a routine step, like Malik was being unreasonable for not doing it. Malik didn't move. He understood what stepping outside would do for them. If they got him onto the porch, the narrative becomes, "We made contact outside," and the entry becomes easier to blur. Malik wasn't giving them that reset. Tiana stood near the hallway opening, close enough to keep their child behind her and close enough to capture the officers clearly on her phone. She wasn't trying to perform. She was doing what a lot of people regret not doing later, documenting exactly who said what and when they said it. Malik asked for badge numbers and names. He asked for a supervisor. Then he asked for the warrant again. Brant answered with the same vague confidence. He kept speaking like the warrant existed, like it was already settled, like Malik should accept it without seeing it. Malik didn't accept it. He asked for something specific. The warrant itself, the reason for it, and the details that would make it verifiable. Brant didn't produce a document. He didn't give a warrant number. He didn't identify a judge. He didn't provide a case reference. He didn't pull up anything official that could be checked. He just kept talking around it. The longer he avoided specifics, the more the situation looked like exactly what Malik feared, an unlawful entry being patched up with authority language. Then, the officers started stepping on each other's stories in real time. One of them kept leaning on the claim that the door was open or unsecured, which made the entry sound accidental and convenient. Another leaned on the claim that they had been knocking for a long time, which made it sound like the family ignored police and forced their hand. Malik pointed out that those can't both be the clean explanation. If the door was open and that's why they entered, the long knocking story becomes irrelevant. If they were knocking for a long time, it doesn't match the family waking up to officers already inside with weapons and flashlights. The officers didn't resolve the contradiction. They tried to push past it. Brant switched to a different tactic. He made Malik's refusal to comply the issue instead of their entry. He demanded Malik's identification again. He treated it like an order Malik had to follow, simply because police said it. Malik refused again, and he explained why in plain terms. He told them they were not going to flip this into him proving who he was, while they refused to prove why they were there. That's when the tone turned personal. Brant started talking to Malik like Malik was the problem for insisting on his rights, like Malik was making it hard, like Malik should stop asking questions and just cooperate. The other officer backed him up with that same energy, pressure through irritation. They weren't calm professionals trying to correct a mistake. They were acting like Malik owed them a solution. Tiana stepped in and demanded the same information Malik demanded. Who are you? Why are you here? What gives you the right to be inside our home? Where's the warrant you keep mentioning? She didn't have to shout to make it sharp. The officers reacted like her asking those questions was disrespectful. That reaction was revealing, because questions aren't threats. Questions are what people ask when the other side won't explain themselves. Then came the part that made the footage feel especially disturbing. One of the officers minimized the danger of what they had done, bringing guns into a sleeping family's home and forcing a father to stand half-dressed while trying to keep his child safe. The attitude wasn't regretful, it was dismissive, like Malik should stop complaining and accept it as normal. That's the mask-off moment, because it shows they didn't see a family being terrified as a serious problem. They saw it as collateral. After that, Brant circled back to the kitchen claim. Marijuana. Consequences. He tried to use it as a lever, as if introducing a new threat could make Malik stop talking about the entry. Malik refused to change topics. He didn't argue about what the officer claimed to see. He didn't explain. He didn't negotiate. He kept the same demand: show a warrant or leave. At this point, the officers were boxed in by reality. They were looking for a fugitive Malik didn't know. They couldn't get Malik to confirm anything helpful. because Malik wasn't guessing or talking loosely. They couldn't produce a warrant to justify being inside. They couldn't control the narrative because the family was recording and the officers had already contradicted themselves. Their body language started shifting. They stopped pressing inward. They began drifting toward the exit while still trying to keep verbal dominance. They continued issuing commands, even as they backed away, trying to leave the impression that they were ending the encounter on their terms. Malik didn't follow them outside. He stayed in the doorway area, still keeping himself between the officers and his child. He made sure the record was clear while they were still in earshot. They entered without consent. They never showed a warrant. They gave conflicting explanations, and they escalated with unrelated threats, including Child Protective Services. The officers left without presenting any valid warrant. No paper, no clear documentation, no accountability in the moment. Just a retreat and an attitude that suggested they expected the family to stay quiet because the alternative was trouble. And the Carters stood there in the aftermath with one harsh truth. The only reason nobody got hurt was because Malik stayed disciplined, while armed strangers tried to bully their way out of a mistake. After the officers left, Malik and Tiana didn't calm down. They went into problem-solving mode. They checked on their child first. The kid was shaken and kept asking if the police would come back. Malik kept it simple and reassuring. Then he and Tiana started preserving evidence before anything could be lost. Tiana saved every file immediately: the interior camera footage, exterior footage, and her phone recording. She backed it up. Malik wrote down a clean timeline while it was fresh. When they woke up, where officers were standing, when guns were visible, what the officers said about the door, when the warrant claim appeared, and when the conversation shifted to marijuana and Child Protective Services. The next morning, Malik contacted the police department and asked for the incident number and the legal basis for the entry. He also asked directly about the warrant the officers claimed they had. The response he got wasn't a clear confirmation of any warrant. It was vague and evasive, which matched what happened in the house. That same day, the Carters contacted a civil rights attorney, Avery Ross. Ross didn't focus on anger. She focused on proof. She asked for the raw footage, not edited clips, and she told them not to debate the department or post anything impulsively. She wanted the story locked down with timestamps and documents. Ross then built the case around the simplest issue: authority and consistency. The officers were inside a private home during the night. The family said there was no consent. The officers implied a warrant but didn't show one. Their explanations for entry changed on camera. When Malik demanded legal justification, they introduced unrelated leverage: marijuana, then Child Protective Services. Ross filed records requests for dispatch logs, call notes, body camera footage, reports, and any warrant tied to that address. The goal was to compare what the officers said on video versus what they wrote afterward. The Carters also spoke to neighbors. One neighbor confirmed hearing sudden commotion and police activity, but did not recall a long period of knocking or announcements. That mattered because it challenged the "we knocked forever" explanation. When the department finally gave a formal response, it leaned on general language about looking for a fugitive and implied they acted appropriately. Ross responded with specifics: what emergency justified entry, what facts connected the suspect to that house at that time, and why officers repeatedly referenced a warrant they couldn't produce. Once the footage began spreading, the department's tone changed. They moved from denial to damage control. They wanted meetings. They wanted to resolve it. The case ended the way these usually end when the video is bad and the paperwork is weak. The city negotiated. The Carters reached a settlement. The department did not frame it like an admission, but the payout and internal review spoke for themselves. There were also policy changes tied to the incident: tighter verification before home entry during fugitive searches, stronger supervisor involvement, and clearer identification and documentation requirements. The city wanted fewer lawsuits like this, And this one was too clear on video to ignore. For Malik and Tiana, the win wasn't going viral. It was forcing the system to deal with what happened instead of burying it. They upgraded security, kept copies of everything, and learned the hard lesson a lot of families learn. When authority shows up wrong, documentation is protection. So here's the question. If officers entered your home and then couldn't produce a warrant while their story kept changing, would you stay quiet? Or would you do what Malik did and keep forcing them to justify every step? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who thinks it can't happen to regular people. And subscribe for more stories where accountability actually lands.